Hi everyone, welcome to the third in our series of Hidden Narratives. As a reminder for those of you who haven't joined us before, these sessions are the one of many steps Edelman is taking to educate ourselves on the issues of systemic racism. The aim being to make real, long-lasting change to our culture. This particular session will be looking at the representation of Black Britain in the media with Dr. Francesca Sobande and our very own Fatima Qureshi. Francesca is a lecturer in digital media studies and director of the BA for Media and Journalism and Culture program at Cardiff University. Her work focuses on the media experiences of Black women in Britain, digital remix culture, creative work, brand woke washing, and the politics of popular culture and power. In this session, Fatima and Francesca will discuss the historical representation of people from African and Caribbean backgrounds in the British media, how the experiences of the Black community in the UK are distinct from the USA narrative on race and media, and why that's important, as well as how the media landscape is changing and what we as professionals working in this arena need to keep in mind for the future. So I'm going to hand over to Fatima and Francesca. Enjoy the talk, drop questions into the chat room, and I'll catch you all later.
Amazing, thank you, Sat. Hi everyone, and welcome to the third installment. As Sat said, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. Francesca is going to be joining me today in a chat in a few seconds. A couple of logistical things to say first. We're going to have a discussion for the next sort of 45 minutes or so, but we really want this to be a conversation. So if you have any burning questions for Francesca as she's talking, please type them into the chat. My colleagues Marie and Via are going to be fielding some of those questions to us at the end, and we'll have about 20 odd minutes to do that. But there's a lot for us to get through, and I really want to pick your brains, Francesca. So if we could get started, welcome. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. I think really maybe the first thing to do is sort of start broad. My first question is very broad, which is we're going to be talking about the title of our topic today is Black Britain in the Media. And I guess my first question is like, why is that issue important? So our whole series is about understanding and dismantling systemic racism. And what I'd like to hear from you is, why do you think that the media plays a key role in helping us do this?
Yeah, first of all, I just want to say thank you very much for inviting me to be a part of this today. And that first question, I think really, whenever anybody asks me a question around why is it important to critically understand and analyse and reflect on issues to do with representation and the media, for me, I immediately start to think about politics. I think about power dynamics. I think about structural inequalities. And I think when we're discussing the representation of Black people in Britain in the media, it's also important for us to think about the experiences of Black people who are working within various media, marketing, and communications industries. So one of the many reasons why I think it is really crucial for us to think about the power of the media and how that relates to anti-Blackness, white supremacy, and interconnected forms of oppression is because we know when we look at the rise of social media, when we think about the development of online content sharing platforms, when we look at the role of different forms of digital networks in terms of transnational formations of solidarity and activism, we know that there are moments when people are able to share a piece of content or post a message, and suddenly it might have a very global reach. So the media, whether we're talking about mainstream media or whether we're thinking about elements of digital culture, is very much connected to the different ways that people are creating impactful messages, are trying to represent themselves and each other. And the media is always, for me, entangled with these issues to do with power and inequality that are never just about the so-called sort of in real world or in real life environment. They're always about the online and the offline. They're always about embodied experiences and material conditions as much as they are about digital platforms and their affordances and the different companies behind them as well.
And I think one of the things that really struck me when we were sort of prepping for this chat and we had a conversation was the kind of broad term that we use for media, right? And when we're talking about media, we're not just talking about news media, we're talking about popular culture, we're talking about social media platforms, digital media versus film versus music versus books, everything. Does it differ sort of across media types? Do you think about it like that?
Yeah, so what I think I'll probably do at this point is hopefully share some slides that should be visible in a few moments for people. And definitely when we're discussing media, I think it's important for us to try to be as specific as possible. So when we're thinking about media, there are different genres, different platforms, different moments when an institution is very much involved as opposed to an individual, perhaps trying to make use of digital tools to participate in DIY or democratized forms of digital culture and communication. And I think when we are speaking about media today, for me, I will sometimes be reflecting on advertising, marketing, and global communications in particular. In other moments, I might be thinking about film and TV. And certainly because my research background really is in digital culture and digital media studies, I'm always interested in those moments where people may be able to push against or bypass some of the more traditional gatekeepers that are associated with mainstream media. So thinking about what it means for somebody to be able to produce a podcast or a web series or develop something themselves on their own terms to a certain extent online, and without having to go through those more traditional media routes that very much still uphold obstacles and barriers that are rooted in anti-Blackness and are rooted in racial capitalism as well. So this first slide, just sort of thinking about, whether it's social media, whether it's film, and thinking about the different types of media that we might be wanting to discuss today. And when I was really sort of reflecting on all of this in advance of this session, I found myself turning to really important research, writing, and activism to do with advertising and to do with the history of colonialism. So here I just wanted to share some words from this publication, which featured alongside exhibitions at the time, Black Markets, Images of Black People in Advertising and Packaging in Britain, 1880 to 1990. And I think this statement is really important for us to continually come back to today. So images of Black people have been employed by every type of advertiser to increase the appeal of their products. These advertisements, directed primarily at the white consumer, have been born out of a definite history of enslavement and colonization. And I think when we're dealing with any sort of marketplace activity, any form of commercial exchange, any type of marketing, we need to seriously reckon with the different ways that these processes have been connected to these histories. So thinking about the ways that colonization, the enslavement of Black people, anti-Blackness and white supremacy has been very much linked to these different moments of marketing and advertising. And when I was reading these words, I was also thinking about how a lot has changed since 1990. A lot has changed, and at the same time, a lot hasn't. But something that certainly has changed is when we think about the rising number of brands that are actively trying to reach out to or connect with Black people as a consumer market. So whilst this statement focuses on the different ways that images of Black people have been produced as part of campaigns that are intended to appeal to white consumers or an institutionally or societally white gaze, I think it's really vital that we also reflect on how representations of Black people are created as part of campaigns that are intended to appeal to Black people, but campaigns that can still very much perpetuate the types of anti-Blackness that we're speaking about today and wanting to push against and challenge.
And I think one of the things that's going to be really, I really want to touch on and come back to later is obviously a lot of this is really vital to the work that we do as a company and as communications professionals. So definitely want to come back to that notion of how you create something that doesn't perpetuate the issue, how we think about that kind of day to day in our work. And one of the other things I wanted to touch on, Francesca, is around when we talk about the issue of representation, and you kind of spoke to this already, how one ensures that there's not just the diversity of representation, because I think that is sometimes what representation in the media is seen to mean, not just seeing or hearing about the same type of people, but also the issue of how authentic, nuanced, and fair that representation is. Could you about that?
Yeah, so I think what I'm going to do is start by picking up on that point to do with ideas regarding authenticity. And I've got a few slides coming up that will relate back to some of this. So I think sometimes there can be this idea that there is this one universal fixed Black experience, or even the term Black community. Sometimes the way that term is used can homogenize or essentialize what it means to be a Black person in Britain, in different parts of Britain, and a Black person who might experience various different issues that don't impact all Black people. And I think sometimes we see organizations or brands grappling with these questions and issues, but doing so in a way that doesn't involve these meaningful conversations surrounding the fact that you could argue there is no one authentic way to represent anybody, but instead what organizations can be thinking about is how do the representations they're creating or the representations that they are amplifying, how do they or don't they reflect different elements of people's lives and the fullness of who they are? How does the process that is involved in producing an image include or exclude Black people? If Black people are included, who are those Black people? What stages in their career are they at? Quite often organizations will focus on conversations to do with trying to ensure more Black people can enter a workplace environment, but then there's silence surrounding questions to do with career progression, to do with leadership. So I think it's really helpful for organizations to sometimes move away from the focus on authenticity and maybe take a more holistic approach and think about not only the representations that are being created, the process involved in producing them, and also the narratives that those representations are embedded within. So here I just wanted to share a couple of excerpts from some interviews that have been a part of my research related to the media experiences and in particular the digital experiences of Black women in Britain. And it was just to highlight some people's different perspectives and again to really reiterate this point that there are many different thoughts on these matters, many different experiences, but something that really came through from these interviews, which were between 2015 and 2018, most of them, and a couple of them more recently in 2020. Something that really came through was just the absence of many nuanced depictions of Black people in the media, especially Black women. And there were sometimes conversations that involved nostalgic sort of remembering of depictions that were actually around in the early 2000s and struggling to identify similar depictions today. So in this case, one person said, I remember growing up watching TV, there was a lot of African-American programs, but of the Black British ones that were here, I remember Cleopatra. So this was thinking about the show Coming At Ya, featuring Cleopatra. And this person said, I think they were from Birmingham, these 3 Black girls, and I thought they were just so cool. This other person made some similar comments and said, it doesn't have to be an exact representation of you. So I think this is touching on some of this stuff to do with authenticity and maybe the move away from authenticity and thinking more about questions to do with relatability or moments of where somebody might feel as though there's a sense of connection to an image, even if they do not identify entirely with that representation. And this person said, but it was just seeing Blackness as much as possible because we do exist, we are here. There were even some shows on BBC. There was this show on TV, Kerching. And I remember all of these shows. These were all very much a part of the TV viewing experiences I had many years ago. And this person was just reflecting on characters in these shows. So the older sister and the sister's friends, that kind of TV show doesn't exist now. Another comment that relates to some of this, and probably some of what we're going to go on to speak about to do with some of the differences between representations of Black people in the US and Britain, and also, for example, thinking about global media flows. So the dominance of US media in general and what that then might mean for Black people in Britain in terms of some of their different media experiences. So this person said, when I was younger, we didn't always have Sky. My mother didn't let us watch TV much, but they were showing Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. But when we did get Sky, we saw that there were channels like Trouble, and Trouble did a good job. They called it urban. So channels like Trouble TV, which for me, I haven't seen something similar to date. Certainly, we have seen changes with the rise of streaming services and the existence of, whether it's Netflix or different alternatives. But I do think that there have been certain moments in terms of the media landscape in Britain whereby there were either more representations available or a wider range of representations available at different times to a certain extent. And that's not to suggest that there have ever been lots of media depictions of Black people in Britain, and certainly media depictions created and handled with care. It's not to suggest that, but I do think that there have been a lot of changes between the 90s, the early 2000s and now, which leave us with questions concerning why were there perhaps images available 10 years ago that no longer are? And what does it mean when a lot of the representations that some of the people I spoke about typically were representations stemming from the US? So there was this real emphasis on a gap in terms of British media. And because of that, my research, which stems from my PhD, initially was going to be to do with the TV representation of Black women in Britain. But as soon as I started to interview people, what became clear was how many people were turning away from mainstream media and going online to create, curate, and share depictions themselves because of a complete lack in terms of what the media in Britain seemed to be offering.
And why do you think that? By the way, this was like super interesting. I used to watch Cleopatra when I was younger as well, and my colleague Via, who's helped organise all of this, is going crazy for that in the chat. She's living her best life, looking back at all of this. But why do you think that that is the case? It's really interesting that, you know, like you said, it kind of everybody says, well, the feeling is, you know, things have gotten better. In my mind, it would be like representation is much better than it was back in the 90s. Why is it that we've kind of maybe, you know, gone a bit backwards? And like you said, that content is available, but it's very much, it's not mainstream. Like that quote which said, you know, it was even on the BBC. Why is it not on the BBC? And a lot of curated stuff that you see. So for example, like Channel 4 had a whole curated season around Black History Month. But that's always been really interesting to me, because I'm like, that kind of pushes it to the sidelines, right? Like, this is something that is interesting to shine a light on, rather than, you know, like your earlier quote said, we exist, we are here, we're part of Britain, but our stories aren't out there. So why do you think that that's happening?
I think we could probably speak for hours about this, but some of my initial thoughts would be thinking about changes in terms of politics, the different shifts we've seen in terms of how conversations, whether it's to do with multiculturalism or racism, or the different moments when anybody who is attempting to speak about anything that involves foregrounding a Black person or matters to do with their lives, how they face a huge number of critiques and obstacles in the process of trying to do that work. So I think there are probably lots of different reasons why we have seen these changes. And unfortunately, I feel as though a lot of them ultimately come down to the pervasiveness of anti-Blackness. I think that I'm well aware of the number of challenges that anybody who is Black working in these industries encounters, whether that is as a producer, a writer, an actor, a performer. And I can speak a bit about this later on, but I think for me, certainly institutional and structural racism is absolutely a part of these problems. And unfortunately, that still is very much a challenge that people are encountering today when trying to do work and trying to create, trying to produce new stories and depictions. And I think also because of that, we have seen these really exciting examples of digital culture emerging, whereby people are saying, I'm no longer going to go to this organization or this institution to seek support or to see if I can somehow share my work through that platform. I'm going to create an entirely new space myself. So maybe a slightly more hopeful note, I would say, even though there are still many absences in terms of mainstream media in Britain, I think there is a huge amount of brilliant work that is led by Black people as creatives, as organizers, as freelancers, but unfortunately, so many people doing this work are unsupported, unfunded, and do a lot of that work often in their own time and at a considerable cost in terms of their health and well-being too, when thinking about the sorts of backlash that they might face.
And that's definitely a really interesting point that I want to come on to later. I'm really interested in that idea of, you know, like not just on screen, but off-screen representation and equality and fairness. Because we've got Fresh Prince of Bel-Air on the screen, I think it'd be great, amazing show for us to now talk about the distinction between British and US representation. You touched on that earlier, that a lot of the kind of issues impacting people from African or Caribbean heritage, that when we talk about representation of Black people in the media, I think it tends to be from a very US-centric lens, and that's a lot of the kind of information that we get tends to be very US-centric. Are there parallels to be drawn, and what is the kind of importance in distinguishing the British experience from that?
So I think there are definitely parallels to be drawn. And here I'm going to turn to some of the words that people shared with me as part of research interviews. I think there are similarities, but there are really, really clear differences that need to be acknowledged too. And I also think when reflecting on both the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air and changes in terms of the cast, thinking about the character of Aunt Viv, the words of the person who I'm now going to think about, also as part of this whole conversation, I think that it is really necessary that we think about the different ways that colorism is a part of these problems too. So when I interviewed somebody, they reflected on exactly these sorts of things. And they said a lot of the time when we talk about imagery of Black women, it's always very American centric. I don't really know why that's the case, because I think that British drama is quite forward thinking with sci-fi stuff and dystopias, comedy dramas. It's so strange that when I think of Black women on TV, I think of Kerry Washington and Shonda Rhimes. We didn't really think that we had the platform to share our own voices. So this person who I'd interviewed is involved in various forms of collective work with Black women and women of color to create these sorts of spaces themselves. So they went on to say, we didn't really think that we had the platform to share our own voices, or we didn't see representations of ourselves. Then if we do see them, a lot of the time they're mixed race. I don't see many Black women in British TV or film, and when I do see them, they're just throwaway characters. So to come back to your question about similarities or differences between the experiences of Black people in Britain and the US, of course, we can acknowledge the global nature of anti-Blackness, of white supremacy, and the different ways that the enslavement of Black people has impacted the lives and histories of Black people in both the US and Britain. But I think sometimes what is really frustrating to see, as you mentioned, is in the context of Britain, when conversations to do with race and to do with racism, and specifically anti-Blackness, because we need to name that, when those conversations happen in a way that actually avoid acknowledging the existence of all of this in Britain. So I think last summer, when witnessing galvanizing Black Lives Matter organizing and Black liberationist work, and watching various organizations issue responses, issue statements, and try to participate in conversations to do with that, something that is really frustrating to witness is when those conversations imply that is an issue over there. That is not part of the history of Britain. And conversations that occur in ways that conveniently distract from thinking about colonialism in relation to the very place that we are in. And when bringing this back to the media, I feel as though what is great to see in the US is incredible changes in terms of the depiction of Black people in the US, whether that's in film, in TV, in different settings. And that's not to say there hasn't been some of that in Britain. But I think that there are massive differences in terms of some of the high profile productions we see occurring in the US that we're yet to see happen in Britain. I think sometimes organizations will really act in ways that make clear they're only prepared to potentially support or hire one Black person. There can only be one idea. And it is so rare. And I even struggle right now to think of many examples whereby we have an all Black creative team or an all Black cast. And as this person was saying, a Black person isn't just a throwaway character. Also, just in terms of how colorism is a part of all of this, I think when we do tend to see depictions of Black people in Britain, in the media, and certainly when they are depictions that are perhaps approached in a slightly more nuanced way, or frames the individual, if we're thinking about TV or film, frames the individual in a way that is not sort of based on one episode, there's actually some degree of character development. More often than not, in that case, that person does tend to be a light-skinned Black person, or perhaps a light-skinned Black and mixed race person. And as this person who I spoke to as part of this research is highlighting, there are real issues to do with colorism. So some organizations will talk about just featuring more Black people in a campaign or hiring more Black people. But what does it say when the representations in a TV show, a film, an advert of Black people are often of light-skinned Black people, or when we are looking at the different ways that Black people are depicted, the comparatively degrading and derogatory ways that dark-skinned Black people are then represented. Just before we move on to the next question, one more quote that I wanted to share in relation to all of this. And the work that I do does involve thinking about the difference between, for example, being Black British and being a Black person in Britain. And I know my first slide, I think I had as the title, Black people in and Black people in Britain in and the media, or something to that effect. And I think things like the in and can be important, because we're not just speaking about representations here, we're speaking about how Black people experience the media as spectators and as producers, as creators. And certainly when we're speaking about Black people in Britain, not everybody will identify as or be identified as British. And this might be for matters to do with experiences of migration, asylum seeking. It might also relate to the regional specific experiences of Black people. So this person who I spoke to, who's based in Scotland and moved there decades ago, when asked about her thoughts on the media representation of Black people there, she said, "My thoughts, it's different from when I first came here. Actually, looking back to then, I didn't even look for them." So there was no expectation of even encountering a single representation of a Black person. Probably because subconsciously, she said, I didn't even expect to see them. But now I think there is more in terms of visibility of them, not necessarily what they do. You see more Black and minority ethnic women on the telly. So this conversation continued in a way which involved being hopeful about the fact that there were more images in certain spaces, but still feeling ambivalent in terms of what those images or what those depictions were or weren't doing. So again, there are so many comments about the fleeting nature of somebody making a guest appearance or somebody who seemed to have been hired on a short-term contract. And I think because of all of that, we need to constantly be acknowledging the relationship between material conditions and work and labour practices when speaking about representation.
Yeah, which again, like, is a really, really interesting point. I was just thinking when you were talking there and saying, you know, there's very few situations where you do witness a moment in the media where, you know, it is like a TV or a film which has had a diverse creative team or like a Black character that is nuanced, has a lot of depth. And obviously, I think We May Destroy You, I think that's what it was called last year, was just like
I May Destroy You.
I May Destroy You, that's it. Like an amazing depiction of that, but it happens so rarely that that's the one that kind of sticks in mind, because you're right, a lot of the other times that's not necessarily what's happening. And I think this idea of you can't have proper diversity and representation and that nuance and that authenticity if you don't have that happening at the back end in terms of who the creators are. So maybe we can speak a little bit about that, because like you said earlier, the whole kind of power dynamic is changing a bit. So because people weren't seeing this happening on mainstream, there are a lot of Black creators who have taken it off mainstream and are doing their own thing and producing amazing content, which I guess, you know, is a great positive. But on the other hand, I think it does bring up issues, like you said earlier, of you know, fair representation when it comes to being acknowledged for the work that you're doing, and having to do work, you know, which is causing having a negative impact on your own well-being because you're not being paid for your time, whether that is actually being paid for your time or, you know, the emotional support that's needed for being a creator as well. So I'd love to talk to you a little bit about that and how we can move things forward.
Yeah, thank you. I think something that comes to mind is those moments when we see images of Black people or the work of Black people being tokenized or spectacularized or treated as sort of a footnote or an add-on. So when considering these last 12 months, I know myself, looking back to say last spring and last summer, there was sort of this flurry of activity whereby organizations that had never made any statement or uttered words such as white supremacy were trying to make clear their investment in tackling anti-Blackness, white supremacy, and interconnected forms of oppression. And I think, unfortunately, as a result of some of that, there have been times when Black people and their work has been sort of momentarily amplified, or Black people have been asked to participate in these one-off gigs that, if they are paid, often aren't paid very well for them. And when I think about the industry's response to these sorts of issues and these dynamics to do with work and employment and to do with sustained support, I think a lot of organizations need to have a long conversation with themselves and, first of all, starts in terms of the internal organizational culture and environment. So who is working there at different levels of that organization? Why are they working there? What is the politics like within that organization? What does it mean when an organization might be more likely to reach out briefly to a Black person who works externally, then ensure that there are opportunities for Black people to work and develop their craft and their career within that organization in a long-term way. And I am always encouraged by the work that I see happening in terms of what Black people are doing with digital tools, how Black people are creating content themselves, how they are collaboratively co-creating knowledge and sharing knowledge in some relatively democratized ways, you could say. But I also worry about moments when organizations that don't have Black people's interests at heart might opportunistically try to approach them in ways that can sometimes involve forms of co-opting that work or commodifying that work and tokenizing that work too.
And I think something else that I've noticed recently, over the past year, is also this sort of taking work that is Black owned, Black created, Black made, and packaging it up in a way that's more palatable for a white audience. There is a lot of that kind of actually taking the work as inspiration, but is that something that you've come across or you kind of have thoughts on? Because to me, that's definitely been something that sits very uncomfortably, and I've been making a real effort to try and not subconsciously be consuming work that actually started off as being created by somebody who's not being acknowledged for it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I couldn't agree more. I think whether it is an organization sort of watching what Black people are doing on Twitter and mining tweets for so-called inspiration to essentially, steal the work of Black people, and to oftentimes do it in a way that may involve also putting that person at risk. So I'm thinking about times when organizations will claim to be wanting to amplify a Black person, but will do it in such a way that there is a lack of conversation surrounding consent. They might end up then actually making somebody hypervisible who does not want to be made hypervisible in that way. So whether that is embedding tweets in a campaign, or it is sharing the work of somebody without crediting them. And yeah, you spoke a little bit there about moments when organizations try to make something more palatable, I think you said. So I've got a few slides that relates to some of this, and it's, for me, part of the work that I've done has involved looking at the different ways that interracial couples who are YouTube vloggers and influencers, how their content, depending on how it is created and framed, can really involve contributing to some of these different issues to do with perceptions of palatable Blackness, or can involve creating content that on the surface seems to involve foregrounding a Black person, but ultimately still really centers the experiences of white people, or at least light-skinned people. So I will see if those slides will share just now, and I can talk through some of that. I think also, as part of this conversation, when you're asking there to do with the different ways that you have seen the work of Black people being, I guess, reframed by organizations, I think something else that happens is when people are specifically talking about anti-Blackness and white supremacy, sometimes organizations can instinctively try to move the conversation away from that and make it a more general discussion about equality, diversity, and inclusion. Or even sometimes conversations to do with racism, within that, there isn't recognition of anti-Asian abuse, there isn't recognition of anti-Blackness, of colorism, of Islamophobia. So I think that it is really important that people are specific when attempting to respond to and contribute to these sorts of conversations as individuals and institutions. I'll see if my slides will keep moving. Before I speak a little bit about influencer culture and interracial couple YouTubers, as I've sort of touched on, I just wanted to really highlight the legacy of collective organizing and self-organizing among Black women in Britain. So sometimes conversations to do with Black women in the media and Black people in the media in Britain can involve this emphasis on the last 10 years or recent years. So sometimes the way that the discourse unfolds, there is an erasure of this really rich legacy of collective work that has come before. And I think it's really important to think about the intergenerational nature of all of this and the fact that Black women have really been struggling against these issues for a long time. So the Black Women in Media Conference in April in 1984 was attended by over 150 women, and it provided space for Black women and women of colour to talk about different aspects of the media in this country, as well as a chance to share their skills. Such an event, for me, exemplifies how for decades, Black women have actively addressed issues concerning intersecting inequalities and the media in Britain. And here I also just want to add, we are seeing many organisations, whether it is those that are involved in marketing and branding, or different areas and sectors and industries, many organisations latching on to this language surrounding intersectionality in ways that can empty that term of meaning as well. So second wave feminist magazine Spare Rib describes the Black Women in Media Conference in the 80s as having involved workshops to discuss a broad range of topics. So these topics included Black women's access to the media's role in perpetuating racism and sexism, a Black women's media network, access to the media and sharing skills, training courses and control of images presented of Black women in the media, and how the feminist media and Black media could be made more accountable to Black women's needs and issues. So we've spoken a little bit about the potential experiences of people who work in this area. And here I just wanted to draw on some words that feature as part of my book, The Digital Lives of Black Women in Britain. And here in this part of the book, I was thinking about an interview with somebody who turned down a media opportunity because they anticipated the sorts of harassment and abuse that they could face from the public, as well as the organisation. And it was a high profile media organisation. And this is somebody who wants to actively pursue a career in this area. But for me, the words that they shared really highlight the futility of media industry diversity initiatives, which are marketed as enabling Black people's entry into careers in the industry, but which fail to actually identify institutional measures to support such individuals if they then face many different types of abuse. So this includes anti-Black, xenophobic, sexist, misogynistic, and Islamophobic abuse, which is also impacted by colorism. As I mentioned there, this relates to my research, which features in my book, The Digital Lives of Black Women in Britain, which was published in 2020, last year, with Palgrave Macmillan. So there are two open access chapters, one which specifically focuses on Black women in the media in Britain, and another chapter which focuses on the digital experiences of Black women. And there's quite a lot in there to do with the digital experiences of Black women and how they're shaped by US media and also Black digital diasporic discussions with Black people in the US and elsewhere. And throughout all of this work, I've really been thinking about how the digital experiences of Black women in Britain are shaped by tensions between digital cultures, communal, countercultural, and commercial qualities. But bringing this back to influencer culture and thinking a bit about those interracial couple vlogs that I was speaking about shortly, or a short while ago, I think that whether it is influencer culture or whether it is the content of a brand campaign or a TV show or a film, there are many moments when we see interracial relations represented in a way that involves a lot of attempts to try and imply that the existence of an interracial relationship somehow signifies that racism is over. So when I was doing this research over the last few years and looking at interracial couple vlog content, I was thinking about how some of this content connects to ideas regarding race, gender, sexuality, and cultural differences. So for me, some of this activity really foregrounds images, identities, and experiences that, despite sometimes depicting Black people, still often centered whiteness and light-skinned individuals. So certain depictions, not only in terms of influencer culture, but in terms of marketing, media, global communications, certain depictions take shape in relation to whiteness and the fetishization of interracial relations and multiracial or mixed race children. So for me, with this example, I'm thinking about palatability again. The framing of interracial couple influencers can contribute to commodification processes and commentaries that put forward this post-racial perspective. So this is the myth that racism has ended, and that because of the existence of an interracial relationship, clearly there are no matters to do with structural racism that need to be addressed. And sometimes we see different media representations will actually exoticize racialized people. And in terms of interracial couple vlogger content, some of this involves the idealization of lightness and whiteness, while still sometimes depicting a Black person within that setting. So the palatability of some of this content for me is dependent on the fact that even if whiteness is not emphasized in various ways, heteronormativity is. And I think this connects also to many different examples of media. So whether it is an advert, a TV show, or a film, when we're speaking about the representation of Black people in the media in Britain, more often than not, we're dealing with representations of people in heteronormative relationships, in heteronormative family settings. And when I did my research, something that came out really strongly was a real awareness of the lack of depictions of, for example, Black queer people, and the different ways that the media landscape is shaped not only by anti-Blackness, but by homophobia and transphobia as well. I think I'll sort of leave that there in terms of my response to that question. I feel like I've probably gone off on quite a few different tangents, but the last thing I'll maybe say for now to sort of bring it back to the work and labour side of stuff, which I feel always needs to be emphasised. We can't speak about representation without thinking about production processes and thinking about work experiences. And this person who I interviewed was reflecting on when they tried to challenge an arts organisation on their racism. And in this case, the person said, when I spoke to them about how the organisation is not representing me and my brothers and sisters, Black and brown in the UK, they said, and this organisation just named one Black person and one Black woman employee, as though that somehow indicated that they could not be racist, as though hiring one Black person meant they were anti-racist and couldn't be anti-Black. And this person who I interviewed said, I say all this in relation to how they use media, as I noticed on their Instagram, they'll often have an image of a Black person sat outside looking like they were minding their own business. They've instrumentalized this young Black person. I think there needs to be a whole rewriting of it. Black women need to be making these programs and these digital platforms. And this comment for me gets to the core of why, when we're discussing media representation, we need to not only think about how organizations create campaigns or develop TV shows or films, we also need to think about brand social media accounts and examples of digital presence and the different ways that images of Black people can be spectacularized and tokenized and instrumentalized as part of brand activity that's essentially about the management of reputation, reputational risk, as opposed to any meaningful interest in addressing anti-Blackness.
Francesca, that's super interesting. The issue that you brought up around the mixed race couple bloggers is something genuinely, like, I've definitely seen, but I've never even considered or thought about how it's making the topic kind of, I guess, more like comfortable to white audiences. There is that palatability issue, which I've definitely noticed in other arenas. One of the other things that really got me thinking about was how, like, you know, in a lot of institutions, a lot of organizations, the creators of the content, so if we're thinking about whether that be PR or an advertising agency or, you know, like television studio, whatever it is, at the moment, what exists is that, you know, there is a lack of diversity and organizations are taking steps to change that, with the understanding that, you know, that change is not going to happen overnight. But I'm hoping that the last couple of years have meant an acceleration in that process. And for sure, I can say from Edelman's perspective, we are definitely really trying. But I would say then that it, like, because that's not happening, when you are thinking of creating content, it's just so important to have that diverse mix of voices right there at the beginning, to create content that really resonates with a wide audience. Which makes me think of the kind of rise of the influencer culture and the fact that the power dynamics have changed, and, you know, that you can kind of work with people who are creating their own content and have their own voice. How do you think brands can do that in a way that, you know, takes into account all the things we were talking about earlier, which is giving people the kind of credit for their work, sort of not using someone's voice for your own gain? Like, how can brands do that, knowing that the long-term goal is to have organizations which are just more diverse, so we're doing that, having that diversity of creation ourselves?
So I think one of the ways that organizations can do that is to provide people with as much autonomy as possible. I think there are so many different decision-making moments within various organizations. So whether it is thinking about the development of a campaign and who gets to decide what, and I think sometimes when organizations hire a Black person or bring a Black person into a team or a particular project, the degree of autonomy they have within that setting is often very limited. Or I would say when suggestions are made, they're often shut down or they're diluted in ways that involve an organization trying to produce something more palatable than the original idea. So I feel as though something that came through with the research that I've done and something I feel very strongly about is many organizations will talk about the training that is perhaps needed to support more Black people. And there's often this emphasis on the idea that people need more training, that they don't have the skills, that there's a deficit. When for me, the problem is top down. It's institutions refusing to recognize the talent and abilities and creativity of Black people and refusing to recognize it in ways that involves affording them the autonomy to do the brilliant work that they're already doing.
Focusing on issues in the system rather than trying to fix the person.
Mm-hmm.
And also one of the things that I want to talk to you about was that you've spoken about digital remix culture. Can you tell me like a little bit about that? What do you mean by that term and like why is that important?
Yeah, so digital remix culture, I think if I was to try and sum it up quite briefly, it's examples of content and media that involves the digital remixing and repurposing of existing material to produce something that is slightly different, which still involves references to previous pop culture moments and previous existing text, previous forms of media. So whether that is thinking about memes or GIFs, for me, digital remix culture has this sort of do it yourself or do it together spirit. It involves people creating content online from something that already exists, mixing it up, changing it, sometimes but not always to communicate a very particular political message or an in-joke that really involves establishing who the intended audience is and potentially who is behind that piece of content. And I think digital remix culture is really exciting because not only do we see it being used as part of important activist work and important forms of transnational solidarity and resistance, but we also see people turning to digital remix culture as a way to challenge organizations and to try and hold brands accountable as well. So one of the projects I've been working on over these last 5 years or so involves looking at the different ways that marketing and branding activity and social justice work and conversations to do with that, the different ways that organizations are attempting to tap into some of that work, tap into some of those discussions. And I've got a book based on this under contract with University of California Press. And as part of this research, I'm really interested in how some brands are trying to replicate the spirit of digital remix culture, but sometimes do it in ways that people are quick to say is inauthentic, or people are quick to say is involving co-opting someone's work or recreating something that somebody's already done and not crediting them. So I think digital remix culture, it's, for me, not necessarily the opposite of mainstream media marketing activity, but it certainly has much more of DIY or DIT sort of intention. And I also think what's exciting about digital remix culture is there's never really this end product. Something's constantly being changed, remixed, and developed. So this one meme suddenly spawns a bunch of subgenres or subcategories, or we can think about this last 12 months and the different ways that people have tried to document their lives and how it's been impacted by all that's been going on. And sometimes that has been in the form of examples of digital remix culture. What I would say when thinking about influencer culture and some of this sort of digital remixing that we see going on and just different changes that I'm interested in, I think the development of computer generated imagery, CGI influencers, throws up loads of different questions to do with some of what we're speaking about today. So in particular, we've seen many Black and racialized CGI influencers emerge in recent years, and brands sometimes partnering with them or collaborating with them as part of work that, for me, brings up a lot of different questions to do with race, in particular to do with the depiction of Black women and to do with these representations or misrepresentations of Black women in the form of a CGI influencer.
That's super interesting and kind of I'm conscious of time because I know there's a couple of questions coming through, but I guess I just want to end it with talking about that. What do you think is the kind of future of media? Where do you think it's going? What are you like hopeful for, but also sort of what are the key things for you that you're like, things have improved, but this is stuff that we really need to work on? And I guess also from our perspective as Edelman, what are the things that we really need to be thinking about, watching out for, and helping our clients with?
So the future of media, I think we will see a mixture of times when people are disengaging from different digital practices and platforms and places, and we're already seeing that. So that might be impacted by different generational shifts, but there will be, for me, a lot of digital disengagement that can sometimes involve a very clear political message. I also think, and we already see this, there can be moves away from more of a public-facing digital presence or digital profile and moves towards a more private, and I say private like this because I think privacy is never guaranteed when we're dealing with the digital, but some smaller spaces or trying to create much more of a sense of intimacy or close-knit conversations and sense of collectedness in different digital settings. I feel as though we are also seeing a real emphasis on local media, local news, and the hyper-local too. So we haven't spoken necessarily about micro-celebrity, although we have alluded to it when speaking about influencer culture. But I think so many times we will see that a message created by or media created by somebody who others know at a local level or immediate level, and that can be more impactful than a message or a piece of media produced by a high-profile organization or a globally known celebrity. So it's maybe coming back to these questions to do with the local, the national, the global moments of both digital connection and disconnection, and times when people are moving away from digital visibility and trying to pursue a more private form of digital experience, whilst recognizing the limitations of that when we're dealing with commercial platforms and organizations. And in terms of any advice, I would just say for organizations who are committed to critically engaging with all of this and doing work in response to it, I would always say start in-house. So thinking about organizational culture and practices, thinking about the sort of content that's produced, or thinking about conversations with clients as well. I think there are often times when individuals and institutions could push back a lot more than they like to admit. And I think that any person and organization needs to have a clear set of values that they are committed to, and being steadfast in that commitment, and being, also public in terms of that commitment too. So beyond issuing statements, where is the long-term meaningful action that an organization is prepared to publicly speak about and prove? And sometimes I think that requires a really critical form of reflexivity and a clear sort of audit in terms of where are things at right now, where has stuff been at previously, and what changes can be made to not only shape the sort of content that we're putting out or promoting, but shape the experiences of those who are working within this organization. And if there is a lack of certain people within that setting, asking why might that be, and what does that perhaps say about the culture itself?
Thank you so much, Francesca. All of this has been very illuminating. I've got a couple of questions that have come through, so I'm going to quickly run through those now so that we don't run out of time. So the first one is from Marie, who says, do you think that social media algorithms play a role here? Could it be that these algorithms don't highlight the work of Black influencers or don't give them the same opportunities to be seen or suggested?
Definitely. So I know, extensive work has been done by many Black women scholars, researchers, and activists on exactly this. So algorithms play a part in so many forms of inequality that relate to the media, relate to digital media. But I would also say alongside that, and we have, sort of spoken a bit about this, but I don't know if we've explicitly named sort of the pay disparities that we see Black influencers, for example, facing in relation to their non-Black peers. So the algorithms definitely impact visibility of content, which can shape matters to do with monetization. But I also think that alongside that, we need to think about what does it mean when the issue isn't necessarily to what extent somebody's content is or isn't visible, but it's to what extent an institution is prepared to pay them the same as they would be paying a non-Black person who has created that media or done that work. Oh, I think it might be muted.
Sorry, thank you. It's bound to happen at least once. Connected to that question was another one around whether we'll see this gatekeeping effect in traditional media repeats itself in digital media.
Mhm.
Could the web become less free rather than more free?
Yeah, I think those issues are already there too. And even just when we were speaking a second ago, I was thinking about sometimes this message to do with amplify Black people or hire more Black people or feature more Black people. Sometimes what's missing from that is what sort of politics or what sort of different types of content are you looking for, and how will you ensure we're not just replicating the same of what we've seen a lot of. So here I'm thinking about classism, for example. I'm thinking about heteronormativity, and I'm thinking about the fact that when organizations perhaps do seek out the work of a Black creative or writer or influencer, whoever it is, it still might be the case that that organization is more likely to approach a light-skinned middle-class person than they are a dark-skinned working class creative writer or person, for all the reasons that we've spoken about. So yeah, I definitely would say, although we do see times when digital culture and different digital tools are being used in ways that perhaps democratize, and I say that with hesitation, some types of media production processes, that doesn't mean that we should have a utopian view of digital culture and its ability to eradicate inequality. Because for me, inequality and structural oppression, it came first. It's not a byproduct of digital culture, and it's not going to go away because of the existence of it either.
And I think something interesting that I suddenly thought of when you were talking there is that all of these things are happening in a response to a system that is broken and doesn't only works for the few, not the many. But the fixing is kind of being done by the people who are being discriminated against. And I guess it's like an easy way of thinking that the situation is fixed without those who are in power and doing the oppressing actually doing any of the work about it. Yeah.
You took the words right out of my mouth. Absolutely. And that's something else that I would maybe add in terms of suggestions for organizations, is be very aware of the burden of responsibility and whose shoulders this work tends to fall on. And I'm also very familiar with how many organizations will expect those people to do the work without any recognition of that in terms of workload, in terms of pay. So that is something that I think so many institutions need to get real about, is who is faced with addressing this, and in particular, if it is the very people who are impacted by these inequalities and forms of oppression, what does it say when an organization is refusing to adequately recognize that work in terms of someone's workload and ensure that they're not essentially doing a lot of additional unpaid work to aid the organization, as opposed to the organization tackling these issues themselves?
Could not agree more. Another question for you. What are yours and others' views about quotas for Black and other ethnic minorities? This confirms in some way this thought that such candidates then need more training, etc.
So I think for me, this is maybe a case-by-case basis. I think, unfortunately, because of the state of the world and the persistence of these forms of oppression, sometimes potentially quotas or targets, at times they are necessary. But what I would say is important that when that is the case, that no institution or individual then implies that because someone is hired, they were solely hired to tick a box. I think we see so many times people are quick to dismiss the appointment of a Black person and claim that it's solely because they will add a Black face to an organization, when for me, more often than not, many of these people are overqualified for the roles that they're appointed to anyway. So yeah, I would say it's important to critically think about how quotas or targets are used, and also how they're potentially positioned to try and imply an organization is more invested in hiring Black people and supporting Black people and ensuring the work environment they enter is going to be one that they can thrive within than it is. But I would never say that quotas and targets are inherently meaningless. I think it depends how they're used and how an institution makes clear to everybody within that institution that if they are to use those quotas and targets, that absolutely does not mean that the person they appoint is not going to be probably more than qualified for that role.
Yeah, I think it speaks to not just focusing on the diversity bit, but also the equity and inclusion parts of encouraging a greater representation in your workforce.
Yeah, just add to that, sorry, just as an addition to that, I also think some organisations that might be keen to use quotas, they won't be transparent about to what extent those quotas are applied at all levels of the organisation. So we're seeing many organisations, they might tentatively be open about the percentage of the overall organisation, people from different backgrounds, but as soon as you ask about, let's zoom in and look at how this maps on to different departments and different levels, and radio silence. So that's another point I think, which I was just thinking about when you were starting to speak there, is never just about numbers and percentages. We need to contextualize things, and we always need to make sure we're not just focusing on one level of an organization and one department.
Totally agree. Another question for you from Emmeline, who says, did you come across any studies highlighting that these stereotype Black people themselves who lack confidence and, for example, are less likely to ask for recognition of their work or promotion? If so, is there also a difference by gender with, for example, this impacting Black women even more negatively?
So I'm not sure if I'm interpreting the question exactly as it was communicated, but my interpretation of that question is whether or not as part of this research I encountered different stereotypes of Black people that were being promoted essentially in the content of marketing and media. I think that's maybe the question, and how that's impacted by issues to do with intersectionality. So yeah, I'm now reflecting on the work of Moya Bailey on misogynoir, so the interconnected nature of anti-Blackness, misogyny and sexism, and also thinking about, again, how whether it's matters to do with classism, ableism, and heteronormativity are part of that too. And certainly when we're discussing stereotypes, we can't just speak about these stereotypes as though they're this blanket, there's this one stereotype that all Black people face. Absolutely, when we're thinking about Black women, those stereotypes can target them in ways that are impacted by all those different forms of oppression that I've just mentioned. And again, I would bring this back to colorism and say that when we're talking about the sorts of oppression and abuse that Black women face, we need to recognise that not all Black women will face the same types of inequalities, and colorism absolutely plays a part in that.
And I think also what I took from Emily's question is also about the fact that there's this onus on creators to do the asking when it comes to, like, you know, getting their work promoted or getting recognition for their work. And going back to our point earlier of brands taking on some of that burden so that people don't have to push to be recognized, that should be something that brands are doing right from the beginning.
Yeah, I think sometimes I've had conversations and people will say things like, we just can't find enough of insert job role, or we don't know where these people are, and this term, you know, hard to reach communities or hard to reach groups. I think, as you said, the onus needs to be, you know, the question needs to be sort of turned back to the organization each time. So if an organization wants to do this sort of work, how are they going to ensure that that work is not going to actually burden the very people that they're claiming to want to support, or whose work they're claiming to want to engage with?
Great. Thank you so much, Francesca. I'm just going to double check if we've got any other questions before I wrap up. I don't think we do, in which case, thank you so much. This has honestly been so enlightening. There's so much stuff for us to think about. Thank you to everyone who's joined us today. The recording is going to be available on our YouTube channel. But yes, thank you so much, Francesca, for taking the time to speak to us today.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and thanks for all these questions too.